Judaism is the oldest of the Abrahamic religions, and it's a little unlike the others. It's a religion, but it's also an ethnicity. An ethnicity is a set of cultural practices and identity, typically but not always passed down from parents to children. It's not, however, a racial group, although that has often been believed incorrectly by people. So my roommate, for example, in college was someone who identified as Jewish. He was from Israel. But he was an atheist. He didn't believe in any of the religious parts of Judaism. He didn't believe in God, but he practiced many Jewish traditions, celebrated Jewish holidays, identified as Jewish, his parents were Jewish, and so forth. So he considers himself ethnically Jewish, although he just described himself as Jewish. And this is true of many Jewish people. And while it's true that there are many people who are not Christians who still follow Christian practices, they don't typically identify as Christians. So, my mom, for example, is an atheist. She celebrates Christmas, but she doesn't identify herself as a Christian at all. There have been many attempts in history to try and think of Jews as a race. The Nazis, in particular, tried to prove that there were racial traits of Jewish people. They failed because there aren't. Here's a picture of some Jewish people in Africa, for example. Judaism is also, very broadly oversimplifying, split into Reform and Orthodox Jews. They have a number of different beliefs. Broadly speaking, Reform Jews are more flexible in their ideology, so that covers both kind of much further right-wing and more liberal beliefs, whilst Orthodox Jews see themselves as being much tighter to the original and Torah-bound beliefs of Judaism. Jewish people were stateless until 1948. They had no country, and there's now only one country in the world, Israel, that is majority Jewish. So that's very much unlike Christianity and Islam, that have a large number of countries that are either explicitly Christian or Muslim countries, or at the very least, like America, a very strongly majority of that country, and people from that religion are very welcome there and supported there. There is a very long history of anti-Semitism. That's the term for hatred and discrimination against Jewish people. This culminated, of course, in the Holocaust, the slaughter of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazis in Germany. I'm sure you've already learned about that, hopefully. One of the things that anti-Semitism often takes is the form of conspiracy theories. This idea that Jewish people are somehow controlling the world, that they're rich and powerful, controlling Hollywood, for example. These go back a long way. One important document here was called the Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion, sometimes just known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a fake. It was a forgery from Russia, but many people around the world believe it's real, and it's basically a plan by these fictional fake Jewish characters to take over the world. And so often you'll hear anti-Semites talking about Jewish people as controlling things behind the scenes and so forth. Anti-Semitism in some ways was fairly dormant in America. I mean, there certainly was some, but it was less pronounced after the Second World War, when obviously people didn't want to associate with Nazis. But it's increasingly getting a comeback. It's increasingly becoming more and more prominent. There's a lot of overlap between various white supremacist groups in the US, such as the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi movements. And these have come together in what we call today the alt-right, the new far-right white supremacist anti-Semite movement in the US. So why do racists need anti-Semitism? So one of the beliefs that racists have, or the fundamental belief that racists have, I guess, is that non-white people are inferior. And also often that non-white people are content to be oppressed. For example, racists will often argue that people of African descent were happy to be enslaved, or that they were better off being enslaved. Right? Similarly, in the US, people argued that segregation was the best for everyone, and people were happy under segregation in the Jim Crow era in the South. However, racists run into an immediate problem with reality here, which is that non-white people do not in fact seem to be content to be oppressed, right? They resist, and the history of racism is a history of resistance, of people fighting back. For example, the civil rights movement in the US obviously was people acting discontent, trying to change the racist system. And so racists need an explanation for this. In addition to just not being content, also in these movements we see incredible power, intelligence, organizing. We see inspiring and incredible leadership. And none of that seems compatible with the view that racists have of non-white people of being, inferior and not able to think and so forth. And so the explanation that racists have often come up with is this idea that, well, there's actually someone behind it, and Jews are often the people that are blamed for this. So during the civil rights movement, it was believed, for example, that Dr. Martin Luther King was being manipulated by Jewish communists who were trying to get him to, upset the balance in the South and, undermine the power structure there, but that he was really kind of a puppet for this Jewish movement that was controlling him. And Dr. King did work with some Jewish people that were, part of the movement. It was a multi-religious movement. There were also white Christians involved in the movement, but, obviously the Southern Leadership Christian Coalition was quite capable of leading themselves. They weren't being led by anyone else. They were just working in collaboration. And today, in particular, we see this theory in lots of ways, but in particular it's focused on George Soros. George Soros is a Jewish man. He's a Holocaust survivor. He is very rich, and it is often believed that he is funding Black Lives Matter, that he's behind the racial unrest in the country. That's not true, of course. The Black community in America, and we're going to find out more about this later in the course when we read a book by one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, but organizing themselves. They're not puppets of anyone, but that's a common belief of anti-Semites, of racists, of white supremacists. And right now, the particular form this long history takes is in QAnon, who, if you haven't heard of them, you're probably better off for it, but sorry, but that's one of the important kind of far-right movements in the country right now. And it's important to be aware of these things because, they can look very silly and ridiculous, but they are also capable of the greatest of evil, and we need to be watchful of these types of movements.